Hi, everybody. It's Monday, somewhere in March, and I hope your spring break was fine. It's April?
Yeah.
Okay, it's April. I didn't get the memo. I have apparently been asleep for 2 weeks. But it's April something, somewhere around the 12th. This video is for next week, for next Monday. Yeah, so we're time traveling today. You had spring break, I had spring break. I hope it was great. Today we're talking a bit about Robert F. Kennedy. And Kennedy, of course, was elected in 1960. Kennedy was the first Catholic candidate to ever become president. He was not the first Catholic candidate to run for president. That was Al Smith in 1924. And Kennedy completes the cycle between Smith and 1924 and 1960, through which that the constituencies of the United States actually switched parties. For those family members listening in the background, I am aware that some of you subscribe to the theory of the switch, and that there are people in the world who believe that the parties never changed constituencies. Well, if you take a look, if you Google Eisenhower's political platform, it looks an awful lot like the Democratic political platform today. And so something changed. The challenges that Kennedy had is that his constituency was a coalition constituency. And there were a variety of interest groups that supported Kennedy in what is ostensibly a fairly new political party system. I mean, the words Democrat and Republican only mean whatever the platform suggests for that year. We're not going to put a whole lot of stock in, the party of Lincoln. The party of Lincoln no longer exists. The party that elected FDR no longer exists. There are different issues with different stances and positions advocated by political parties every 4 years, despite the name. So if you are engaged in a tribal support or dislike of the name of a political party, you don't make a whole lot of sense, because those things shift over time. And did you shift or did they shift? That's never quite clear. But we do know that in the 1960s, when Kennedy is elected, he is elected in the middle of the Cold War. And that Cold War, of course, creates an awful lot of problems in managing the issues faced by the executive branch. We know that the Korean War was not won. It simply had a stalemate. That's the reality that Kennedy finds himself in. He finds an emerging concern with Vietnam. The French had been defeated in Dien Bien Phu in the middle of the 1950s, and we had sent a couple advisors to Vietnam to help them not become communist. Kennedy is going to escalate that by sending real troops who shoot real guns and engage in combat. Kennedy and Nixon both ran for president in 1960, and they had the first televised interview ever. This first televised debate. This first televised debate saw Kennedy say, "Yes, I'll take the makeup. We're going on TV. I want to look good." Whereas Nixon said, "No, I'm not wearing makeup. I'm a guy. Guys don't wear makeup." And 60% of those who watched on TV thought that Kennedy won, and 60% of those who listened on the radio thought Nixon won. It turns out that finally optics matter. Not only does a candidate appear in a newspaper ad in a static position, but now candidates are on television. And television changes the way we perceive people who are trying to become president, which is why we elect an actor in 1980. Well, in any case, Kennedy contributed to Dr. King staying out of jail, as we spoke about last time. And Kennedy moved relatively slowly with civil rights. Kennedy knew that the old Democrats, who he could have received support for and may have received support from, did not necessarily support his actions in advocating civil rights in the American South. And the American South is largely Democrat at this time. So moving relatively slowly, it took 3 years to craft the Civil Rights Bill, which he was not going to sign because of his assassination. But it provided equal access to public facilities. It's during this time that Dr. King led the March on Washington, where 200,000 African Americans heard the I Have a Dream speech. In fact, it was just last week we saw the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King and the mountaintop speech. I've been to the mountain. Kennedy also advocated a space program. He advocated fair housing and minimum wages. He wanted tax cuts, which doesn't sound very democratic. And he supported and finally signed the 24th Amendment, which is no poll tax. Those are some issues that faced Kennedy during his administration that he viewed prominently. In 1962, the Russians responded to American missiles in Greece and Turkey by attempting to put nuclear weapons in Cuba. I hope that you can find and watch a movie called 13 Days. That's a good family movie for you to watch this evening. 13 Days, is it on Netflix or Prime? It's somewhere. I know that I streamed it at some point for my summer school class 2 years ago. But Kennedy had a problem with nuclear weapons in Cuba. Could the United States president allow nuclear weapons on our doorstep and risk a Russian first strike? Well, Kennedy didn't believe he could. And the Russians wanted those weapons there because they were, of course, boundaried by nuclear weapons around the world. So the challenge was that if you declare a blockade on Cuba, it's actually an act of war. A blockade is an act of war. That's how the North started the Civil War with the South. Okay, you can argue with me about who started the war. I'm just saying that when Lincoln blockaded the South, it is technically an act of war, and it becomes a real war. If Kennedy blockades Cuba to prevent those missiles from becoming operational, is that an act of war? Well, we called it a quarantine. How topical. And by quarantining Cuba, we said that we would allow essential items in. We didn't want to be sinking ships with baby food on them, but we would stop and search any ship suspected of having nuclear weapons parts. And it's a complicated series of events. I really hope you've watched the movie 13 Days. Other than Kevin Costner's terrible accent, it's actually a quite good movie that parallels very closely the actual events of 1962. One of the reasons that Cuba was so willing to be belligerent towards the United States is that Kennedy had supported something called the Bay of Pigs invasion. The United States military was going to give Cuban exiles in Florida a bunch of guns and then send them into Cuba to attack Castro's army, and our military would support that invasion. It turns out we gave them guns and we helped them get to Cuba, but we did not in fact support the invasion with the United States military. It was a bit of a disaster. And if we were going to engage in any hostilities with Cuba in the future, it could not be in a Bay of Pigs way, which was just one of the worst political choices ever. In 1963, in Dallas, Texas, in an open motorcade, John F. Kennedy is shot. And the video is online. It's not something I encourage you to watch in a sensationalistic way, but if you are not aware of it, it is preserved through the Zapruder film. If you look up Zapruder film, kind of like it sounds, good luck, you'll find what is likely Lee Harvey Oswald killing John F. Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald is caught. He runs from a book depository to a warehouse. You are, of course, familiar with the comparison between the assassination of Lincoln and the assassination of Kennedy. That's something fun to talk about at the dinner table tonight. Maybe you look it up. But before Lee Harvey Oswald can be put on trial, the very next day, he is assassinated by a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. Why would a Dallas nightclub owner kill the guy who killed the President of the United States? Well, there are as many theories as there are people in the United States. It could have been the mob who was behind all this. Kennedy, of course, had been running with some Las Vegas types. He hung around the Rat Pack. And, of course, the communists hated Kennedy because we're in the middle of a Cold War. The Cubans hated Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Russians, of course, hated Kennedy for making them look silly by forcing them to back down in Cuba. The Republicans hated Kennedy. There were an awful lot of people who hated Robert F. Kennedy. There were some former Democrats who did not like his work on the Civil Rights Act, who from the South, A lot of Southerners hated Kennedy. A lot of people hated Kennedy. So for a person who was as beloved as he was in U.S. history, I mean, we call his administration Camelot because it was idyllic. But the reality is that he had an awful lot of enemies. And so the investigation, if you're following along on Edmodo, we're on slide 20. The Warren Commission is established to investigate the assassination of Kennedy. And they seal the file for 50 years. For 50 years, the Warren Commission conclusions about the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy are sealed so that when it's finally opened, those who may be hurt by the information would probably be dead. That takes us to 2013, when the Warren Commission report is released, and there's literally nothing in it. There's no one hurt by it. There's no information of any kind that's valuable. So why seal it at all? Well, it certainly hides the fact that the Warren Commission found nothing. And it didn't give us any insights into the assassination of Kennedy in any way. So Lyndon Johnson becomes president. Lyndon Johnson is a supporter of civil rights. Lyndon Johnson will sign the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and hoped to create what he called the Great Society. Now, in quotes, the Great Society. This was a topic that was on last year's AP US History test, and I covered it in class just like this, and the students missed the question. They're like, you never said Great Society. And I'm like, here it is in the slides. Pretty sure I said Great Society, so I'm telling you right now, Johnson was a supporter of the Great Society. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act is signed in 1964. Is that a big deal? Of course, the Civil Rights Act is a huge deal. The Civil Rights Act does a variety of things. The Civil Rights Act is the largest single reform since the end of slavery. It bans different voting standards, requires equal access to public facilities, says the government can keep funds from public or private groups that engage in discrimination. Boo discrimination, right? It bans discrimination because of race, sex, religion, nationality by employers. And it creates the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So, real quick, I just have to fast forward to the future. Not like post spring break future, but from 1964 to today, we have seen an awful lot of Civil Rights Act of 1964 legislation be pushed aside, ignored, or contravened by executive directives. Here's a quick list of the 2016-2017 changes to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Department of Justice rescinded Title IX provisions, which of course is equal access by gender in school sports. The Department of Justice proposed eliminating the federal contract compliance program so that there doesn't have to be any form of equality in giving contracts out by the federal government. The executive branch said that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not prohibit discrimination. Changed Title VII so that we no longer prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation. So now, contravening EEOC guidelines, there can be discrimination based on sexual orientation. Recently, in 2016, the Justice Department filed a brief saying that states can purge their voter rolls in order to change the makeup of those who vote, the demographics of those who vote. The executive branch halted an EEOC a rule that supported equal pay. So if you're all for equal work for equal pay based on gender, that's not a thing anymore because the government got rid of it. The Justice Department argued that businesses can discriminate against LGBTQ and more individuals. So discrimination is coming back. The Department of Justice rescinded guidance on Title IX and decreased schools' obligations regarding sexual violence. If sexual violence happens on a campus, there's no longer federal reporting requirements for it. It just happens and people don't find out, except in the local community. The government eliminated 72 guidance documents outlining responsibility for schools with students who have disabilities. Basically dramatically reducing school responsibility for special needs students. The government eliminated transgender worker protection under Title VII. The government allows religion to discriminate against transgender individuals. The government ended a lending anti-discrimination program, so that now redlining could potentially occur again. Ended community relations, the Community Relations Service, which was established by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and made sure that community action happened in an equitable manner. All of this took place in the first 2 years of the current administration. I got tired of writing, and I didn't detail all 2018, 2019 instances of rollbacks of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but I can tell you that much of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 have been rolled back. And the future is yet to be written. I don't know if we're going to continue to do so, but that's where it's headed now. And I feel like it's important to understand that while we celebrate the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is sharing what it used to be, I think you ought to vote. That's what I think you ought to do, one way or the other. Whatever you support or don't support, you need to vote. And I will see you tomorrow.